He says, if you'll note, he says he doesn't go after anybody like Santo, myself, Carlos in Louisiana. He says he doesn't touch any of us.
Santos Traficante was the mafia chieftain in Tampa. Carlos Marcello was the godfather of New Orleans.
And I says, you mean to tell me that you pay off Hoover? And he said, absolutely not. He wouldn't take a penny in front, especially from a guy like me. And he laughed. I said, well, how do you do it? He says, I know at least a half a dozen of his friends that are friends of mine. And he went like this to show like quotes. He says, and they take pretty good care of me.
But Hoover's gambling and his dubious friendships never tarnished his image. To the public, Hoover was a real-life hero. He and Clyde Tolson were treated like movie stars. The two snappily dressed bachelors were often seen in New York's most fashionable night spots. One of their favorite hangouts was the Stork Club, managed by Sherman Billingsley, who used to place illegal bets for them. It was here one New Year's Eve that Hoover and Tolson betrayed the secret they shared, a secret that could have destroyed Hoover's reputation and his career.
Well, it was a wonderful night at the Stork Club. It was New Year's Eve, 1936, and I was the only woman at the table.
Louisa Stewart, a famous model, and her boyfriend Art Arthur had been invited to join Hoover and Tolson at Walter Winchell's table.
We all had on those crazy hats and the things you blew, and at one point I'm pointing a toy gun at Hoover, who has his hands up, and it was just a great night. It was getting really late, and Hoover was rather annoyed with Clyde. He felt Clyde had too much to drink. And finally the decision was to go to the Cotton Club up in Harlem. We went in the FBI limousine, and Art and I sat in the back seat, and Clyde and Jedgar, as we called him, sat in the two jump seats. And then I saw that they were holding hands. And I guess he was forgiving him, but I thought it was sort of odd. Without a love of my own. I remember the Cotton Club that night very well because there were a couple there who were black and white dancing together. And that made Hoover furious. And then Clyde, who was still pretty drunk, said, well, he'd like to dance with Hoover, which we all thought was very funny. Well, we left, finally, and in the taxi going home, then Art said to me, it's common knowledge that they're queer, that they're fairies. Those are the terms used in those days. But he said, we don't talk about it.
Whether we like it or not, it's always been true that a public man's private sex life makes him vulnerable. Hoover knew this. He would eventually seek out one of the most distinguished psychiatrists in Washington to ask for advice and help because he was so terrorized by his own sexuality. What was he, as director of the FBI, to do about these urges that he had?
In Washington, D.C., police detectives were picking up intelligence about Hoover's private life.
Guy Hoddle was a retired or fired agent. He was an alcoholic. And Hoddle would, every time he had a few drinks, he would tell stories about parties that went on in J. Edgar Hoover's house when that there were sex parties there, no girls. So when you say sex parties, what does that mean if you have no girls?
I remember Ash Resnick at the Caesar's Palace. He used to be the manager of the nightclub there. He told me that Meyer Lansky had some pretty strong evidence that Hoover and Tolson were both homosexuals.
When he was asked what that meant, he said that Lansky had obtained photographs of Hoover in a compromising situation with Clyde Tolson.
One man who actually claims to have seen such photographs is Gordon Novell, a controversial figure with connections to the intelligence community. Novell, who had worked for the White House in the early 1960s, became involved in a complicated legal action which the White House wanted him to pursue, but which Hoover wanted dropped.
So I went to the White House, and the White House sent me to Mr. Angleton, Director of Counterintelligence, CIA. We met in a restaurant, and I told him my problem, and he says, I know what your problem is. He said, you need to tell Mr. Hoover that you've met with me and that you're not going to dismiss the lawsuit and that you've seen this. At which point he opened up his briefcase and pulled out a couple of photographs of Mr. Hoover in flagrante delicto, I guess is one way to describe it. Having oral sex.
This testimony does not stand alone. I talked to a former regular officer in the OSS, that's the predecessor of the CIA, who said that after the war, he went to dinner with other OSS American intelligence colleagues, and that after dinner, when over the brandy stage, when conversation turned to the private lives of public people, his host went out of the room and then came back with a photograph. And this was passed around the table, and the photograph showed two men, Hoover and Tolson, engaged in homosexual activity.
In New Orleans, where the CIA and the Mafia had sometimes collaborated, Mafia Don Carlos Marcello told Gordon Novell that he, too, had seen a photograph.
I had volunteered the information that I had seen a picture of Mr. Hoover in performing oral sex, and he said that he had seen it, too, and that had been used to keep the FBI, but not the Justice Department, off the back of the mob.
Meyer Lansky had some pretty heavy stuff on Hoover, that he was a homosexual, without any question. And he'd shove it to him if he ever had to.
Irving Resnick said Lansky was the guy who controlled the pictures, and he had made his deal with Hoover to lay off. That was the reason that for a long time we had nothing to fear from the FBI.
In the 40s, we hardly touched organized crime because the Bureau did not believe that there was a mafia, or did not allow us to investigate the mafia as such.
For the vital decades of the Mafia's growth, Hoover denied that nationally syndicated organized crime existed and ignored all evidence that it did.
There wasn't one mention of the Mafia. There wasn't one mention of organized crime activities during the training course that I and all other brand new FBI agents went through in Washington. Not one mention of it.
In fact, the Bureau in Washington had no organized crime division. When I went to the supervisor in Seattle and asked why we weren't going after the Mafia, he said, we don't use that word. Hoover doesn't acknowledge that there's a Mafia.
Mr. Kennedy, do you expect to delve into any particular fields when you take over as Attorney General?
Well, I think that there are a number of different areas and where action is needed. I think that in the field of organized crime, I think it's a very serious situation that's facing the country at the present time.
Before the Kennedys, the mob had literally been getting away with murder.